I had hoped this vacation would bring us closer together, but instead, it became the breaking point of our marriage. My wife and I had been married for 10 years. Life had been good in many ways. We had 2 beautiful children who were our pride and joy. But over time, something had shifted between us. Like most parents, we got caught up in the never-ending cycle of responsibilities. School runs, work deadlines, doctor appointments, and everything else that comes with raising a family. By the time we crawled into bed at night, we were too drained to talk, let alone connect on a deeper level. Our days felt like a repetitive loop. I would wake up early to help get the kids ready for school, while my wife handled breakfast. After work, we tag-teamed dinner, homework, and bedtime routines. Then we would sit quietly in front of the TV before calling it a night. Weekends weren't any better, filled with errands and kids' activities. Somewhere in the middle of all this chaos, we had lost us. It hadn't always been this way. Back when we were dating, my wife and I could spend hours talking, laughing, and simply enjoying each other's company. But now, even when we had free time, it felt like we didn't know what to do with it. Conversations had turned into discussions about bills, or who would take the kids to soccer practice. That's when I suggested the vacation. A break from the routine seemed like exactly what we needed. No kids, no work. Just the 2 of us reconnecting like we used to. I pictured long walks on the beach, candlelit dinners, and lazy mornings where we could finally talk without interruptions. I believed this trip could help us remember why we fell in love in the first place. She agreed without hesitation. Maybe she felt the distance too, or maybe she was just ready for a change of scenery. Whatever the reason, we booked a tropical getaway, a chance to reset our relationship. I was hopeful, even excited, that this trip could bring us closer. We arrived at the resort early in the morning. The warm sun, the sound of waves crashing against the shore, and the laughter of carefree tourists filled the air. The beach was breathtaking. White sand stretching for miles and crystal clear water shimmering under the sunlight. For a moment, it felt like the perfect escape. Our first day was filled with small joys. We walked hand in hand along the shoreline, letting the waves wash over our feet. She giggled when a small crab scurried past her toes, and I couldn't help but smile. It was the first time in weeks I'd heard her laugh like that. At dinner, we shared a candlelit table overlooking the ocean. The sunset painted the sky in shades of orange and pink as we talked about how much we needed this break. It felt good, like we were starting to connect again. But even amidst the smiles and laughter, I noticed the cracks. She spent more time on her phone than I liked, scrolling through social media or texting friends. When I asked her to join me for a sunrise walk the next morning, she shrugged it off, saying she needed to catch up on sleep. It wasn't a big deal, but it stung. In those quiet moments, when we weren't distracted by the beauty around us, the distance between us became more obvious. I caught her staring off into the distance more than once, her face thoughtful, almost wistful. When I asked her what she was thinking about, she would brush it off with a vague, nothing important. I didn't press her, but deep down, I wondered if she was as invested in this trip as I was. Still, I held on to hope. After all, we were here to rebuild what felt broken, to remember why we fell in love in the first place. I told myself that these small moments of distance didn't mean anything, that they were just a byproduct of the busy lives we'd been leading. This vacation would help us find each other again, or so I believed. But sometimes, when you ignore the cracks, they only grow bigger. I was about to learn that no amount of sunsets or sandy beaches could fix what was already slipping away. The beach was alive with energy one evening, a perfect blend of chaos and joy. The sun had dipped low into the horizon, casting an orange glow over the ocean waves. The air was filled with a vibrant mix of sounds. The rhythmic beats of Afro-Caribbean music blaring from speakers, the crash of waves against the shore, and bursts of laughter from the crowd gathered for the night's festivities. Vendors moved through the crowd, shouting offers for cold drinks and snacks. Their colorful carts added even more flair to the lively scene. The heart of the activity was a large makeshift stage set up near the water, surrounded by tiki torches flickering in the warm evening breeze. A lively announcer, microphone in hand, hyped up the crowd, calling for participants to join the much-anticipated dance competition. A semicircle of onlookers cheered, clapped, and whistled as volunteers stepped forward, eager to show off their moves. My wife's face shone with the same excitement that had first captivated me all those years ago. She'd always had a passion for dancing, and tonight was no different. She leaned in, her eyes twinkling, and said, "I want to do it." Her voice had the innocent tone of a child asking for permission. Before I could respond, she was already slipping off her sandals and heading toward the stage. At first, I didn't think much of it. She'd always enjoyed moments like these, being the center of attention, soaking up the energy from the crowd. It was just her nature. I settled into my seat with a drink in hand, watching her move through the crowd with an eager smile. The announcer greeted her enthusiastically, handing her a numbered sash to tie around her waist. The crowd cheered louder as she climbed onto the stage. I chuckled quietly. This was typical of her. Always ready to dive into the fun, never one to stay still. Part of me admired her boldness, the way she could lose herself in the moment without a second thought. But the other part of me, the more reserved side, preferred to observe from a distance. Still, I didn't mind. I was content to let her enjoy herself while I stayed back. When the announcer called for participants in the dance competition, my wife's face lit up with excitement. At first, I didn't think it was anything unusual. It seemed like just another fun part of the vacation, a small break from the stresses of everyday life. Then he appeared, her dance partner, a young, charming local with a confident walk and a smile that could win anyone over. His athletic build and sun-kissed skin made it clear he spent plenty of time in the ocean or playing sports. His movements were fluid, sure, as if he owned the dance floor. Before the music even started, he introduced himself with a bow that made my wife giggle. She offered him her hand, and from that moment, it felt as though I no longer existed. They began dancing, and I watched as he twirled her effortlessly, making her laugh and blush. She seemed so carefree, so full of life. For a brief moment, I thought maybe this was good for her. She deserved to have fun. But as the dance went on, a knot twisted in my stomach. The way he held her waist, the way she leaned into him, it was too much. I stood there on the sidelines, clapping awkwardly along with the crowd, but I felt like I was in a different world. The cheerful music seemed to mock me, its lively beat ringing in my ears. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. Every laugh, every lingering touch, felt like a knife to my chest. Was this really just about the dance? Or was it about everything we'd ignored in our marriage? The distance, the silence, the way she so often sought validation from others instead of me? When the music ended, the applause was deafening, but all I could feel was anger. As they bowed and exchanged smiles, I knew I had to say something. I walked up to her, trying to keep my voice even, and said, "Can we talk for a minute?" She frowned but followed me a few steps away from the crowd. I could feel the heat of my frustration building. "What are you doing out there?" I asked, struggling to keep my tone steady. "This doesn't feel right. I think you should stop." She looked at me, her expression shifting from confusion to defiance. "What's the big deal?" she snapped. "It's just a dance. We're on vacation. Can't I have a little fun?" I tried to explain how it made me feel, but she didn't seem to care. Her tone grew sharper. "We're married, but you don't own me. You're not going to tell me what to do." Her words hit me like a slap. I wasn't trying to control her. I just wanted her to see how much this was hurting me. But in that moment, I realized she didn't care how I felt. This wasn't just about the dance. It was about how disconnected we had become, how little she seemed to value our bond. I swallowed my pride and gave her one last warning. "If you go back out there and dance with him again, you won't find me here when you come back." She laughed, as if I were making a joke, then without another word, She turned and walked back to him. The music started again, and I stood there for a few seconds, watching as she smiled and continued, completely oblivious to the storm raging inside me. As I stood there, on the edge of the beach, watching her spin and laugh with a man we barely knew, I realized something I hadn't wanted to admit for a long time. Our marriage had been broken for years, and while she danced, I stood frozen, realizing how many times I had ignored the signs. I had overlooked the signs. The quiet dinners where we barely spoke, the nights spent scrolling through our phones rather than conversing, and the times she seemed distracted. I convinced myself it was simply stress or exhaustion, but that dance. It was a final straw, a painful reminder that we had been drifting apart for far too long. I turned and made my way back to the hotel. I didn't storm off, and I didn't shout after her. What was the point? She hadn't even noticed I was gone. As I reached our room, the emptiness hit me like a wave. It was the kind of silence that made me feel lonelier than ever before. I started packing my things, my hands moving mechanically. I had no plan, no destination in mind, only the certainty that I couldn't stay there any longer. I couldn't bear to watch her prioritize a fleeting moment with a stranger over the man she had promised to love forever. I booked a taxi to the airport, my fingers trembling as I confirmed the ride. Sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at the suitcase I had just zipped up, it suddenly struck me. I wasn't just leaving this trip behind. I was leaving behind the dreams I had for us, the life we had built together, and the woman I had once believed was my forever. But in that moment, I knew I deserved more. Not perfection, not some fairy tale, but someone who truly chose me, someone who saw me. As I stepped into the taxi and instructed the driver to head to the airport, I felt the weight of everything I was leaving behind. Yet, for the first time in a long while, I also felt a sense of clarity. Sometimes, letting go is the only way to rediscover who you are. When I arrived home from the trip, the silence in the house felt heavier than ever. It wasn't the kind of quiet that comes after a long day or when the kids are at school. It was the silence of something missing. Her presence, her laughter, even the faint sound of her favorite music playing in the background. It was all gone. As I sat on the couch, staring at the empty spot where she would usually curl up with a book or her phone, the memories flooded back. I thought about how we met, how her smile used to light up every room, how we used to talk for hours about our dreams. Back then, it felt like we were invincible, like nothing could come between us. But somewhere along the way, we stopped being us. Life got busy, work piled up. Kids arrived, bills mounted, and conversations turned into brief exchanges about schedules and groceries. The connection we once shared was buried beneath years of routine and neglect. I couldn't stop replaying the moment on the beach when she laughed at me, her face full of defiance, her words stinging. "You don't own me." It hit me like a punch to the stomach. She hadn't felt free in our marriage for a long time, and I hadn't noticed. Maybe I had been holding on too tightly, trying to control everything, when all she wanted was to breathe. But her words weren't the only thing that hurt. It was the way she chose to walk away right back to the dance floor, to a stranger who could make her laugh in ways I hadn't in years. That image burned in my mind. I realized I had been holding on to an idea of our marriage that no longer existed. The truth was, we had been broken for a while, pretending everything was fine when deep down, we both knew it wasn't. I thought about the good times, vacations, birthdays, nights we stayed up talking about nothing and everything. I wanted to hold on to those memories, but they felt like sand slipping through my fingers. They no longer outweighed the cracks that had grown between us. Love alone wasn't enough to fix what had fallen apart. Sitting there in the silence of our home, I felt a strange mixture of emotions. There was sadness, of course, for the life we had built together that was now crumbling. But there was also relief. Relief that I no longer had to fight for something neither of us could save. It wasn't bitterness or anger. It was acceptance. A bittersweet understanding that sometimes, no matter how much history two people share, they can still drift too far apart to find their way back. I didn't know what the future held for me, but I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't keep living in a marriage that felt more like a battle than a partnership. Leaving her on that beach wasn't just about the dance. It was about reclaiming my sense of worth, my happiness. And while the pain of letting go was real, so was the hope that maybe this was the start of something better for both of us. After that vacation, my wife's life took a different turn. At first, she didn't seem to understand the gravity of what had happened. When she returned home, she was greeted by the emptiness of our house. A house we had once built together as a symbol of our partnership. My things were gone, the rooms felt colder, and the silence echoed louder than any words I could have spoken. She called me a few times during the first week. Her voice was a mix of confusion and frustration. She didn't understand why I had left or why I couldn't just come back and move on as if nothing had happened. I tried to explain it. I tried to make her see that the issue wasn't just about the dance or her partner. It was about years of feeling invisible, about her seeking validation from everyone but me, and about her refusal to see the cracks in our foundation. Over time, her calls became less frequent. Maybe she was starting to accept that our relationship had truly ended. She stopped asking me to come back and began focusing on her own life instead. All that mattered to me now were the kids. That beach dance may have been the final straw, but in truth, our marriage had ended long before she twirled into his arms.